Well, if you don't remember all of Samuel's story, I'm going to fill you in on a few of the details. Remember, his mother Hannah was barren, and she asked the priest of Israel, Eli, if God would open her womb and bless her with children. If so, she would give her firstborn son to God's work. And so it came to pass. And several years later, she appeared at the temple and delivered Samuel as a young boy to be brought up in the temple under Eli's care. We do not often think of the grief of this scenario. A young boy left without father or mother in the hands of a priest whose wife is not mentioned and whose grown sons are running amok. Not an easy situation for a young boy. A few verses later, Samuel hears his name being called in the night, and he runs to Eli, the priest, asking if Eli called him. No, Eli said, it wasn't me. Go back to bed. And it happened again. No, go back to bed. But the third time it happened, Eli realized that God was trying to speak to Samuel. And so he says to him, when you hear your name called again, say, here I am, Lord, speak, for your servant is listening. And Samuel did so. And the word of the Lord that came to him was distressing. It proclaimed that Eli, who had not curtailed the selfish and oppressive behavior of his sons, would be punished, and that both of his sons would die on the same day. So Eli came to Samuel the next morning and insisted that Samuel tell him what God had said. You can imagine the conflict and grief Samuel felt about telling his father figure that his house will end in ruin. And yet it was a formative experience as well, for Samuel learns that God is no respecter of power, privilege, or position unless they are used for justice and are executed with compassion. But it's a lesson that's tinged with grief. When Samuel was old, he had appointed his own sons as judges over Israel. But they did not follow in the ways of their father, and they perverted justice and took bribes and oppressed the poor. So the people of Israel came to him and demanded that he anoint a king, saying that his sons were as bad as the sons of Eli. Whoa, that was a kick in the stomach. Grief again knocks on his door. Samuel was opposed to the idea of a king, thinking that a king would oppress the people. But after much discussion with God, he agreed to anoint one. As God's spokesperson, he anointed Saul. Saul, it says in the Bible, and I quote, was the most handsome man in Israel and stood head and shoulders above everyone else. It's great. It sounds like, one of those magazines you see just before you go out at the grocery store, in the rack there. Those ones about the very popular paper. Saul, tallest man in Israel, and the most handsome among us. So Samuel does anoint him and works closely with him for many years. But Saul ultimately fails as king and is rejected by God. It is a confusing bit of storytelling because we're not exactly sure why Saul was rejected. Maybe it's because he kept booty from a victory for himself, or maybe it's because he presented an unlawful sacrifice to God, or maybe it was his mood springs. He's almost clinically bipolar. But it doesn't really matter from Samuel's point of view. It just means more grief for him. His friend and the one he anointed failed in God's eyes. And so in the verse just before our text today, a very rare idea is expressed. It says, and I quote, "The Lord was sorry that he had made Saul king over Israel." What? Isn't God all-knowing? Didn't God know that Saul wasn't the right guy to begin with? You mean God made a mistake and said he was sorry for it? My goodness. This text calls into question the idea that God is some external anthropomorphic being separate from creation that holds all knowledge and power in his or her hand. Even in these ancient times, people were willing to think of God in different ways. It points to thinking about the Bible not as a once and for all declaration about who God is, but seeing the Bible as a conversation about God. Conversation that happens in the Judeo-Christian tradition, our tradition. The way we express this in the United Church of Christ is to say God is still speaking. So God says in our first verse today, "How long will you grieve over Saul, Samuel?" I'd like to believe that God had some empathy here for Samuel, realizing that Saul was close to him, and that when he asks how long, he might be thinking of, a longer period of time. But it's hard to get away from the idea that God is just giving him a kick in the butt here and telling him to get on with it, get out there, because you have to anoint a new king. Quote, God says, "Go to Bethlehem and look at Jesse's sons and anoint one of them king. I'll tell you which one," God says. Poor Samuel. You see the problem he's having? He's being asked to anoint a king while another king is still alive and well and sitting on the throne. And kingship is not a two-party system. So, rightfully so, Samuel is afraid for his life. God goes, "Oh yeah, that's right. You could be killed by Samuel. Okay, try this. Go down to Bethlehem with a heifer and tell them you're going to make a sacrifice." Which means, in one part, on the one hand, they're going to sacrifice a heifer to God. On the other hand, they're going to have a feast, a holy feast. It's like setting them down and saying, "Hey, go on down and serve them communion." Yeah, that's a good idea. Serve them communion. Then they'll never know while you're really there. A couple weeks ago, I used a quote from Jesus. Be innocent as doves and wise as serpents. And this is an example of that. He's got a little craftiness going on. When he gets there, of course, the elders are nervous because Samuel is a man of immense power, a prophet and a judge in Israel. And there's a war going on with the Philistines. And if Samuel shows up, something bad could be going down. So they say, "Do you come in peace?" "Yes," he says, "I've come to sacrifice to the Lord." And then following is the central idea among many ideas in this rich story. Before they have their feast, Jesse's sons line up, in my mind. And they line up by age, and the oldest is Eliab, and Samuel looks at him and thinks, surely, he is the anointed of the Lord. But then God says to him, don't look on his height, the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on his heart. And immediately, we remember Saul being the most handsome man in the land, who stands head and shoulders above everyone else. And we also remember that Eli said to Samuel as a young boy, when God calls, say, speak, for your servant is listening, not looking, but listening. What is this about? Sight versus listening. Seeing with your eyes, or listening to the heart, listening to God. And the message is clear. When discerning God's guidance, when seeking the direction of one's soul, the image of God within, human sight is an inadequate tool. The human sense of hearing, if we are listening to our heart, is preferable. And this message rings out very loudly in our cultural context. For almost everything, we rely on sight, which often proves untrustworthy. Advertisers know the quickest way to get their fingers into our wallets is through our eyes, by bombarding us with images of sexuality and excess. A consumer economy lives on sight. Do we really think that wearing the same watch as Heidi Klum or Tiger Woods will make us more attractive and successful? Yes! As a matter of fact, we do. That's why they do it. We buy the watches, the cars, the hamburgers, the light beer. And it's related to the commandment to have no graven images before us. Why? Because images can be so fetching. The cultural images of success, power, and popularity, our secular gods, loom over us, manipulating us in ways of which we are not aware, making promises to parts of us that feel unsuccessful and powerless and lonely. Did you know that almost all of the presidents elected in the last century have been taller than their opponents? Promising a security to those parts of us that feel small and insecure. Of course, there are other elements that come into a presidential election. Otherwise, the NBA would all be our president. There is one study out there that notes that all of our corporate heads, CEOs, just about all of them are over 6 feet tall. So, sight alone speaks to our own sense of inadequacy. Listening to the heart is a different thing. The place where the image of God is in us revealed, it's an entirely different matter. The heart is the place of wisdom, connection, and empathy. It takes time to sort out all the voices that are coming at us, to calm ourselves, to sense the connection to all things and all beings that is inherent in creation. To sense the message of the heart, one must sense the juncture where all who are involved in a particular decision can be joined with compassion, honoring each and every one. It's not a perfect science, but this is what God is hoping Samuel will find. Eliab, the oldest son of Jesse, is not anointed, and neither are the other ones. On and down the line, one after the other, God says no, 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 and when he gets to the end of the line, Samuel, who is already filled with grief and struggling to understand what he's supposed to do, turns to Jesse, the father, and says, "Is this all of your sons?" And he says, "Well, our youngest one is, out tending the sheep." "Oh, really? Well, go fetch him, because we're not going to have any feast until I see him." And so someone runs off to get him. You can see the older brothers just kind of rolling their eyes. What we don't understand is that shepherd in the ancient world is an image for king, because a shepherd has to have empathy for their flock. They have to know which ones are the ones who are a little skitterish and are likely to go taken off of the cliff and fall over. Or they have to be willing to step in front of a lion or a wolf to risk their own lives for the sake of their flock. They understand the deeper connection between them and themselves as shepherds. So the fact that he is a shepherd to the ancient world makes him a good option for a king. But then there is this other thing that happens in the text. God, the Bible really confuses me sometimes, I got to tell you. Here we've been told not to look, but to listen to the heart. And then in the text describes David. He's ruddy, with beautiful eyes, and very handsome. What are they trying to say to us? What's he trying to say? I'm going to go with, he's trying to say that sight sneaks in even when we're trying to be aware of listening to the heart. Because, well, you know the end of the story of David. And his good looks do him in. So there it is. It's a reversal of expectation, and a new king is found, and God is still speaking. And there are chapters of intrigue and betrayal to follow. The death of Saul and his son Jonathan, David's best friend, before it's all over. And as you know, David abuses power with the rape of Bathsheba and the murder of her husband. But when push come to shove, David was willing to stand for God and the people in Israel in such a way that justice was maintained and compassion was carried out. But what about Samuel? The prophet who carried his grief in his heart for his entire life. This was the last act before his death. What was the hope that gave him life? I would say this. He knew that he was connected to that larger reality we call God, to that river that continues to run through every age, bringing compassion and justice and joy to humankind, and looks forward to that time when all human beings will live together in peace. Samuel was content in all of his grief to know that there were others in the next generation who listened with their hearts and were willing to say, as he and David said as youngsters, "Here I am, Lord. Here I am." And God is still speaking to our hearts. And what do we say? "Here I am, Lord. You know I'm not perfect, but here I am, Lord. I may be young, Lord, but here I am. I may be old, but here I am. I may be carrying grief, but here I am, Lord. I may be busy, but here I am, Lord. I may drink too much, but here I am, Lord. I may be too preoccupied with the images of success, fearing failure, fearing loneliness, but here I am, Lord. I'm listening with my heart. Send me to be your presence in the world. Send me to carry the gifts of the heart to the next generation. Send me to be your presence of justice and compassion in the world. Here I am, Lord. I am listening with my heart